The Stanley Cup Final picture is beginning to come into focus. On today's edition of the Theory of Hockey show, we break down the biggest lessons of the playoffs so far. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of the Theory of Hockey show. I am your host, Nick Zararis. Theory of Hockey is the home of Do You Know Puck and The Journey, the exclusive free hockey trivia games at thetheoryofhockey.com, where you can prove and test your knowledge against every other hockey fan that's out there. On today's show, we are going to be walking through some of the big prevailing and developing storylines in the conference finals across both series. We'll hit on goaltending in particular, which is a fun conversation because everyone likes to draw conclusions. We'll talk about the center depth battle out west, how Carolina is pulling away from Montreal, and a whole lot more. But to start out, I would be lying to you if I told you I thought the Golden Knights were going to be this in control of their first round series against Colorado. While I do think a lot of us, me included, and I say that with authority, I was definitely not high on Vegas going into the playoffs. I picked Utah to beat them in 6 in the first round. Vegas spent a lot of the regular season as a meandering team, almost 20 overtime and regulation combined losses, fired their coach, Bruce Cassidy, with 8 regular season games remaining in favor of John Tortorella, brought Carter Hart in off the street earlier in the season, somebody who hadn't played professional hockey in the better part of 2 years because of his role in that World Junior scandal. And looking at Vegas, did not see the vision because after 82 regular season games, you like to think you have an idea of what a team is. And that's why generally our regular seasons ultimately influence a lot of our thinking about our postseasons, what's possible, what's feasible. And for these teams, for Vegas in particular, you are watching in real time what happens when it comes together at the right time. Now, Vegas on paper has a very talented group, and I would venture to say they are probably the only team in the entirety of the NHL that has comparable center depth to the Colorado Avalanche. While nobody is taking Jack Eichel over Nathan MacKinnon, Jack Eichel is within shouting distance of Nathan MacKinnon. If MacKinnon is the second or third best center in the league, Eichel is at worst the sixth or seventh best. And Eichel has shown a real development to his game over the last couple of years. He really took a leap defensively when Bruce Cassidy got there a number of years ago, and he's been one of the best players in the NHL since getting to Vegas, getting that neck surgery, replacing the disc with the artificial one. And you start there, where Eichel is at least within shouting distance of MacKinnon. Then Tomas Hertl versus Nazem Kadri or Brock Nelson, whichever one you like. Hertl has been a bit I would say Hertl's acquisition hasn't gone as smoothly as either party would like. His underlying numbers have been relatively stable, but his counting stats have never been crazy in Vegas. And some of that is a byproduct of how Vegas plays, especially under Cassidy, who defense first coach. A lot of scoring chances aren't going to happen. When you're a defense first team, you're going to have to maximize the few chances you do get. Hertl's dealt with a variety of injuries over the years. He's always had the injury bug, but he, when on, is just as good, I would argue, as Nazem Kadri. And then I feel no hesitation in saying I think William Karlsson is probably better than Brock Nelson. I know Nelson was a Selke Trophy finalist. I know Nelson had a really good regular season, but you're seeing Nelson hit the wall now in these playoffs where he's playing a smaller role. He's not putting up as good of stats. The underlying numbers for Vegas aren't crazy. They've spent a lot of these games with leads or in close games where they've conceded some control of the game. Colorado's been able to make stuff happen, but on a pure talent basis, consider that Vegas's 2 leading goal scorers in the playoffs are Pavel Dorofeyev and Brett Howden. You think about the fact their star power, like Eichel, like Mitch Marner, have done really nice jobs as well. And then you add the fact that Mark Stone has been dinged up in these playoffs and what that means for that team. And Vegas on paper was designed as a win and in team. And a lot of the time, you'll listen to me talk about the trade deadline and the NHL's lack of parity or its false parity as being illusions that a lot of teams say, all we need to do is make the playoffs and we can go on a run. They point to the St. Louis Blues in 2019. They point to the LA Kings in 2012. And they say, if they can do it, why not us? And for the first time in a long time, Florida in 2023 is a really good example of this. A team that went really nuclear, had Sergei Bobrovsky play as the best goalie in those playoffs, got all the way to a Stanley Cup final, won a bunch of games in overtime on the way to the Stanley Cup final, beating Boston and beating Toronto and really finding the next gear that ultimately elevated them. And then the following year and the following 2 years, as a matter of fact, they came back and won the Stanley Cup. That's what you were watching happen in real time with Vegas. There was nothing in Vegas's regular season sample that would lead you to believe this was a team that was going to go on a run. They had really bad finishing in the regular season. They had really bad goaltending in the regular season. That's part of why they've turned to Carter Hart, why they've pivoted away from Aiden Hill. And the center depth has favored Vegas in this series. MacKinnon did leave game number 3 with an injury before returning. But the other big storyline in this series, and something I do want to talk about more, is Cale Makar. Now, we all know Cale Makar is one of the best defensemen in the world today. If you prefer Quinn Hughes like I do, I have no problem with that. I think you can make an argument Makar's resume is the most impressive of any player through the first 6 seasons of their career, maybe since Bobby Orr, who won multiple Hart trophies and multiple Norris trophies in that start to his NHL career. But Makar is one of the best we have today, and he's clearly dealing with a serious injury to miss multiple games. He got back in game number 3 and did his best. But a lot of this conversation around Makar, I think to some degree is unfair. I think we all can assume that if a guy is this good at his sport, if he is this decorated this early on in his career, he's carried himself with a certain degree of self-seriousness and professionalism that's going to drive him very far. And I didn't like the way Jared Bednar had said it's up to Cale if he wants to play, because I think if you're a coach, you want to put your guys in the best position possible to succeed. I think the very straightforward thing to say, if you were Jared Bednar in that situation, is Cale wants to play. He's going to try and play, and we will see if he can play. He's going to take warm up, and we'll go from there. I think anytime you as a coach, as an authority figure, are putting pressure on a player who is injured to play, I think you are doing them and yourself a disservice. Now, I understand hockey culture is very different. I understand that there is a reverence and, frankly, an expectation that guys who are injured and are close to being able to play suck it up. They endure. And I think that takes away some player agency. I think that invites questions as to whether or not a player is effective enough when they are injured to a certain degree, if it's worth them continuing to play. And all of this is to say, I am not in the business of telling other people what they should think. I think anyone who gets up on the moral hill of, well, this player's soft for not trying to, I think you're missing the boat. Now, I think it's best practice that if a guy is hurt, you leave it up to them and you don't put external pressure on them. I think there are times where it would benefit the player for a coach or a doctor or somebody affiliated with the team to pull them inside and say, hey, I know you want to play, but I would rather you sit a game or two and try and get a little bit closer to returning than trying to gut this out and not being effective or exacerbating the injury. Now, we hear all types of conjecture. We hear all types of speculation when it comes to this. Well, if he plays, he'll make the injury worse. Can it get worse if he keeps playing? All of this is against the backdrop of player empowerment. All of this is against the backdrop of labor rights. There is a very traditionalist mindset in the greater hockey ecosystem where you have people like the fine folks at Overdrive, which, like, to be fair, I do like listening to Overdrive on TSN radio every now and then. But one of the takes they have, one of the workshop takes they have is, if you dress for a game, even if you're injured, you are not above criticism. If you feel good enough to play, you deserve to get criticized. I don't think that's fair. I think that's a one size fits all rule. I think that lacks nuance. I think we should be talking about the Avalanche in Vegas in the context that Colorado's regular season was really smooth. They came out of the gate on fire. They had a playoff spot locked up effectively in mid-January. Now they're facing their first real adversity all season. Did Minnesota ding them a little bit last round? Yeah, Makar got hurt and they won a game. Now in this series where they're down 3-0 as of the time I'm recording this, and they are dealing with Makar being at well less than 100%, who gutted out 27 minutes in game 3. MacKinnon, who left game 3 for a period of time dealing with an injury. When you are dealing with your 2 best players with serious injuries to the point they cannot play, I think we need to take a step back. And the other side of this, Vegas is peaking at the right time. You know, there's a lot of jokes about, well, they're getting the new coach bump. Yeah, the new coach bump is real. When you change voices in the middle of a season, that usually yields short-term results. Now, does John Tortorella get credit for Carter Hart making more saves? Not really. It's not like John Tortorella was telling guys not to make saves and Carter Hart started playing better. I think Vegas has really tapped into something with the group they've assembled, because guys like Dorofeev and Brett Howden have taken on significant roles, and then Eichel and Marner have done great jobs as far as their even strength play and their counting stats. And while Colorado is carrying play at even strength, Vegas is scoring more at even strength. Vegas is controlling play. And I think now that you're looking at this and you're in crisis mode now. If you're Colorado, you're down 3-0. You got to win one more game just to get this back to your barn and hope you can win maybe 2 and get this to a respectable point. But I think Colorado ran out of gas. I think there's a strong case to be made that Colorado, by virtue of being the oldest team in the NHL this past year, the youngest player they featured in their playoff lineup so far, Jack Zararis, 25 years old. That's a team that is dealing with a lot of regression right now. They're not scoring nearly as much. They don't have their best puck mover on the back end. And I think the last point on this series before we move on and change subjects, the great defensemen in our game today are capable of playing as a fourth forward at times. They are influential on play the way a fourth forward would be. They create more offense. They create more offensive opportunities. They lead breakouts. They carry pucks out. And Makar is probably the best skating defenseman, at least as far as straight line speed goes, in the entire world. And when he can't unlock those doors, you're dealing with a lot of rim outs. You're dealing with a lot of alley-oops. You're putting guys like Josh Manson, like Brett Kulak in a lot of one-on-ones. And if you want to dissect the defense, the way you attack in today's game, you put guys on islands. You make defenders make decisions in space, and you force them into making a decision. Your goal as an attacking player, regardless of sport, is to put a defender in conflict. Defenders have rules within systems, defensive structures. They are supposed to do a certain action if the play develops in a certain way. If the puck goes to one place, they are supposed to follow. If it goes to another, maybe they hold their ground. It could be zone. It could be man. But when you can put defenders in conflict, you can force mistakes. That's where a lot of your offense is going to come from. And this time of year in particular, where every team is really talented, where every team is really good, those mistakes are often going to define what happens across the board. Now, the last thought I have on this series, Vegas deserves a lot of credit for the way they've responded to their regular season in the playoffs. I did not think they had this in them. I think Colorado hitting a wall, dealing with injuries to Cale Makar, probably their most important. No, though I would say MacKinnon is their best. They are in as dire as it gets. Now, 3-0 in hockey is different from 3-0 in the other sports. It's more doable than the other ones, but you wouldn't take that bet. That's a crazy thought to think that Colorado is going to be able to win 4 straight games against Vegas, who has thoroughly outplayed them in 2 of the 3 games so far. And I really am disappointed because I thought this Colorado group, especially the way they went about assembling this roster, did it the right way. I really liked the way they incrementally improved over the course of the last 2 years. They auditioned a variety of guys. They settled on that MacKinnon, Kadri, Brock Nelson down the middle. Nichushkin is finally healthy. Gabe Landeskog, after missing the last 3 regular seasons, returns, plays 55, 60 games in the regular season. That makes a difference. They had a real bona fide top 6 for the first time in a while, where it wasn't just Nate Dogg and friends. You had MacKinnon and Natchez, you had Landeskog, you have Lehkonen. They have a really nice group, but the back end has not been good enough for them in this series, and it's leading to the offensive issues. You know, they're scoring 2 goals a game in this series, and that's because they're spending too much time on defense. They're not getting to offense as fast enough, and they're not creating as much offense. Now, the next subject I wanted to talk about on today's show is goaltending, because once you get to the Final Four, this is where people like me, content people, media people, start to try and draw conclusions, start to try and draw ideas, to make hypotheses, to do research, to check them out. And one of the prevailing sentiments you are watching, especially because of this Final Four, is what you pay for your goaltending. Because you are watching in real time 4 teams that have adopted piecemeal to some degree approaches to their goalie rooms. The Hurricanes have been a revolving door the last 5 to 10 years under Rod Brindamore in net, where Freddie Anderson's been there for a while now, but Peter Kochetkov has had nice years in there. Brendan Bussey won more than 30 games for them in the regular season this year. There was an Alex Nedeljkovic season in there. There was a Peter Mrazek season. There were Antti Raanta seasons. When you're going through 5, 6, 7 goalies in a 7 or 8 year window, you're not particularly married to any of them, but you want to play the guy who you feel is going to be the best behind the team you have. And I think that's the approach you were watching play out in Carolina, in Vegas, and in Colorado, where Those three teams have assembled units in front of them, 18 skaters, 12 forwards, 6 defensemen, who are supposed to play at a high enough level that all the goalie needs to do, don't lose us the game, please, play at a reasonably high level, unlock just enough ceiling that we can win. I think you are watching in real time those two theories go head to head, because the last couple of years, Florida goes back to back. Bobrovsky, highest paid goalie in the entire league. Earlier the decade, Tampa Bay. Vasilevsky is on his RFA deal, the first cup they win, and then he's an $8.5-9 million goalie, I believe, on the second one. But you look at Darcy Kemper in 2022 and Aiden Hill in 2023. Okay, those are middle tier goalies. And those are guys who a lot of teams feel our goalie is capable of playing within that range of outcomes. And that's the thing. Goaltending is about a range of outcomes. You are paying when you have a Shesterkin, a Vasilevsky, a Bob, a Saros, Ottinger, Swayman, whatever goalie you think of when I say really good goalie, you are paying for certainty at an uncertain position. The vast majority of guys you put in your net are going to ebb and flow based on how well the team in front of them plays. There are limitations to what a good goalie can do. You saw Igor Shesterkin put up really good underlying goaltending numbers this year on an abomination of a Rangers team that finished dead last in the East. And I know Shesterkin was hurt. He missed a good month and a half of the season. And ultimately, if him and Adam Fox had stayed healthy, maybe the Rangers are more middle of the pack as opposed to bottom of the pack. But I think you are trying to draw too quick a conclusion if you say this is definitively the one way to do this. Now, I think it's more replicable and more teams have the chance of building a roster this way because there are so few good goalies to go around. I think a lot of the conversations we have about goalies, their value and the positional value is very similar to what we say when we talk about quarterbacks in the NFL. Because there are 32 teams and every single one of them needs a quarterback, and there are 32 teams in our league and every single one of them needs a goalie, you are never going to have 32 good starters simultaneously. It's just not possible. There are not enough guys that good at the position to do that. So in that case, when you're a team like Nashville, who arguably has missed its window 2 separate times, and you still have UC Saros under contract for several more years into his mid-30s, you're going to hold on that guy and hope you might be able to assemble a team around him. Ilya Sorokin, there was no question the Islanders were going to extend him a couple of years back, in spite of the fact that the team looked like it was going to eventually hit a wall. The Rangers 2 years ago thought they were in the midst of a window of contention. They made Shesterkin the highest paid goalie in the league. The team fell apart entirely around him, and they won't even entertain the idea of trading him. Now, all of this is to say, I think you can win a Stanley Cup with that middle of the tier guy, the middle tier goalie guy, and I think a lot of teams think they can. I think your cutoff point, and we've seen this play out in real time in the NFL, where who's the worst quarterback you could win a Super Bowl with in the contemporary era? We saw Jimmy Garoppolo go to a Super Bowl. We saw Brock Purdy go to a Super Bowl. We have seen Patrick Mahomes come to define this era. But this past year, you saw Sam Darnold, somebody who had been on the QB carousel for a number of years, get into an offense that was able to amplify his best traits. They were able to take advantage of their personnel advantages with guys like Jackson Smith and Jigba, with Kenneth Walker. That's the type of look you want when you have these goalies, where Aiden Hill, any given day, is probably like the 18th or 19th best goalie in the league when he's playing reasonably within his average range of outcomes. But during that Cup final run, he was the 8th or 9th best goalie in the league. And that's enough. I think your cutoff point is in the playoffs is about the 9th or 10th best goalie in the league. If you have a guy who can reach that ceiling on a good team in front of him, especially one that plays good defense, I think you can make it happen. And Carter Hart has gotten better as these playoffs have gone along, as he's played more. I want no part of the guy. I'm very glad the Oilers did not end up signing him. I'm very glad none of the teams I care about signed him, because I don't want any part of him involved in my potential hockey experience. I think your desperation should come at a limit. I think anytime you're willing to associate with guys like Carter Hart, who, look, if you're going to do he was acquitted, yeah, even if you want to give him the grace that he doesn't deserve of saying, well, he was acquitted, he was still in that situation. If you don't have the wherewithal or the foresight to recognize this is wrong, I should not be here, we should not be doing this, that reflects really poorly on you. And he's acted extremely entitled the entire time, as if he were aggrieved for missing time in the NHL as the investigation played out. I think anytime you're dealing with a guy like that, who is clearly operated on the idea that he's better than everyone else, you're inviting problems. Now, for Vegas, it's worked out in the short term. We'll see how far they can ultimately go with him at this point. But You look at where that position's at, and I think it's a reasonable question now. Is it worth it to have the franchise goalie who starts 60 games? Or would you rather have the Scott Wedgwood, Mackenzie Blackwood tandem? Would you rather have the Freddie Anderson, Peter Kochetkov, Brandon Bussey trio? I think the one caveat here is Montreal. And Montreal with Jacob Dobes and Jacob Fowler are an extreme outlier here. It is extremely infrequent that you see a young goalie, especially this young, this little NHL experience, get a team this far. I think it is extremely impressive that Dobes has arguably been Montreal's best player. He's only 24 years old. He's effectively 2 years into his NHL career, and he's been their best player and gotten them this far. He is playing 9-12 goalie in a series where his team is being outchanced effectively 2-1 in most situations. Carolina is playing exactly how you would expect them to. Majority of the possession, a majority of the volume within the game. Overall, 62% of the chances, 67% of the shot attempts, 62% of the expected goals, 61% of the high danger chances. Carolina is dominating in all facets of the game, and Dobes has limped the Montreal Canadiens to 2 overtimes in spite of the fact that he is facing 66% of the shot attempts in a given game at even strength. Carolina's depth, that Robinson, Jankowski, Carrier line has been lights out in this series. And if you were trying to game this out, what the recipe for Montreal looked like, you got good game results where you got to overtime twice. You would assume you go to overtime twice, you probably win one of those games. And if you win one of those games, we're sitting here with Montreal up 2-1 in spite of the fact they've been outplayed. When you are trying to manufacture wins as the team with the talent disadvantage, and you would argue with the style disadvantage for the playoffs, you need to keep the game close, which Montreal is doing. They are not scoring enough on the power play. That is a massive concern. They are getting the goaltending, but if you're going to pull off the upset, your secret sauce, your recipe is the goaltending and the special teams. That's how we have seen the New York Rangers in particular find ways to beat Carolina in the postseason, is lean on Shesterkin. And then when you do get those power play opportunities, you got to bank them. And Montreal has not found ways to convert consistently on the power play. Carolina's credit, they got a great penalty kill, one of the best penalty kills in the NHL for much of the Brind'Amour era. But you are looking at Montreal really struggle to find ways to create offense. 2 consecutive games, less than 15 shots on goal. You're not going to win against Carolina like that. And they're not going to give you the inside. So the few chances you do get, you're going to have to convert. And Carolina is doing a really good job of wearing Montreal down. Now, is this tiring? Is it frustrating? Yeah, I think Carolina is definitely having to work harder than maybe they expected to win this series. But they've been in pretty good control of all of these games since Montreal got out to the big lead in game number 1. Carolina's been pretty much lights out ever since they came back and started scoring in that first game. Now, if you're Montreal, you got to find a way to win a game in regulation. You got to find a way to score 3. If you can get to 3, Dobes will give you a chance to win. Spoken as somebody who watched Hank and Shesterkin play their asses off in games where they were thoroughly outmanned and found ways to limp their team across the finish line. I really like the group Montreal has. You can tell they're probably a little bit ahead of schedule. They're a little bit early. Beyond Suzuki, beyond Caulfield, not a lot going on. You're waiting for Slafkovsky. You're waiting for Demidov. They have talent. No mistake about it. Montreal is a very exciting team that has a golden opportunity in front of them because they have so much cap space, because they have a lot of draft picks, because they have a lot of prospects. Montreal is going to have an opportunity to really set themselves up nicely going into the second half of this decade. But you're not out of this. At 2-1 down, you are going to have a chance on home ice in game number 4 to level the series at 2, and anything can happen. You as Montreal, who has been outshot, who has been outmanned, are in this series. You are very much in this series. And I think Dobes gives you a ton of confidence. And I think that's something you can take for granted at times when you have the great goalie, is that you know your guys got you and you're thinking, okay, how do we get to 3? How do we get to 3? For Carolina, if you can score 3, that's going to be enough if you're Montreal. If you can score 3 against Carolina, that should be enough to get you through one more game. Now, if you're Montreal, that Carolina forecheck is giving you fits. Carolina has done a masterful job of limiting Lane Hudson's ability to break the puck out. They're doing a really good job of pressuring him, especially they're running that hyper-aggressive 2-man forecheck where they're putting 2 bodies on him and forcing him to rim pucks out or alley-oop them out. And that's just not a good way to play hockey in these playoffs. I think anytime you are stuck to the degree Montreal has been in these playoffs, you're going to end up in a really rough situation. And the last point on this series before we move on, I wanted to talk a little bit about depth, because the playoffs, once you get to this point, pretty much everybody's got at least one superstar. I know Carolina, you would argue, is probably the lightest of the four teams as far as star power goes on an individual basis. Aho's been a top 20-ish guy in the NHL the last 5 to 10 years, somebody who's put up a lot of counting stats on good regular season teams. Svechnikov really just has the one really good regular season. I think Jarvis is a fringe superstar. He made the Olympic team as an injury replacement, but beyond that, up front, Carolina is really a depth group. You think about the work that Blake, Taylor Hall, and Jackson, Blake, Taylor Hall, Logan Stankoven, there we go, the center. I couldn't think of him. When you have those three guys as your de facto third line, you're going to have opportunities. Now, that Hall line has finally seen some regression to the mean as far as their goals for and against in this series. Montreal got them for a few in the earlier rounds, but over the last handful of years, you've watched really good third lines define playoffs. Last year, Brad Marchand, Anton Lundell, Esto Luosterainen, 52% of the shot attempts, 53% of the scoring chances, 76% of the goals for and against, 55% of the expected goals, 53% of the high dangers. The one everybody thinks about, Coleman, Gord, Gaudreau, 52% of the scoring chances, 53% of the shot attempts, 57% of the goals, 55% of the expected goals, 58% of the high danger chances. Going a couple years back now, going way back to 2015, Andre Palat, Tyler Johnson, and Nikita Kucherov, 54% of the scoring chances, 52% of the shot attempts, 67% of the goals. They outscored opponents 23-11 in the playoffs in 2015. 55% of the expected goals, 55% of the high danger chances. I go back to the Keto, Kakko, Lafreniere kid line from 2022. 54% of the scoring chances, 55% of the shot attempts. Outscored opponents 10-5, 67% goal share, 53% of the expected goals, 50% of the high danger chances. Go even further back. Zuccarello, Derek Brassard, Benoit Pouliot. 53% of the shot attempts, 48% of the scoring chances. 62% of the goals outscore opponents 13-8, 55% of the expected goals, 52% of the high dangers. You go to the original misfits, the William Karlsson, Riley Smith, Jonathan Marchessault, 57% of the scoring attempts, 56% of the shots. They outscored opponents 27-13 on the way to their Stanley Cup Final appearance. 57% of the high dangers, 54% of the expected goals. Incredible numbers, and that type of depth wins this time of year. You have to assume that each team's respective star power is going to cancel each other out. You have to assume that your stars are going to play just as good as your opponent's stars, and it's your depth guys that are ultimately going to prove the difference. Last year in the Stanley Cup Final, that Marchand, Lundell, Luosterainen line proved to be the difference. They outplayed the Oilers' depth, and when matched up against Connor McDavid, they outscored Connor McDavid directly. If your third line is good enough that it can control games, outscore opponents, you have real opportunities in front of you. Montreal's third line with Zachary Bolduc and Alex Texier was doing a great job in the earlier rounds of these playoffs, taking advantage of some of the depth weaknesses of the other teams, the other opponents. But now you are watching in real time Carolina's depth really proved to be the difference. And the last thing I wanted to get in on this truncated episode before we take our and the last thing I wanted to get in on this episode before we call it a show, yes, a little truncated this week, but with my new work schedule, I've been a little more haggard and a little bit less tapped in and having to take a lot more time to do research. The last thing I wanted to get in before I call it a show, I am so shocked at some of the results we've seen so far in these playoffs. You look at the results you are getting where Hurdle and Karlsson and Eichel are outplaying MacKinnon, Kadri, and Brock Nelson. I think you look at the fact that Carolina has not only won the way they have against Montreal, they have dominated Montreal. And I think the fact that Montreal is here at all is really impressive. I'm going to have a soft spot for Marty St. Louis forever. One of my favorite guys as a player. I think his philosophy as a coach, always looking at growth opportunities, always looking at positive reinforcement. I think that's a really ideal way for your coach to talk about players. And I wish more teams had the foresight to look to guys who could put themselves in the player's shoes a little bit more. And I think St. Louis is someone who's going to have a very nice career as an NHL head coach, should he choose to stay with it long term. And then the last point on today's show, I think Carolina's ready. Look, is Carolina Vegas an exciting matchup? I think style-wise, it presents a very fun opportunity. I think Vegas has a clear-cut talent advantage. I think defensively, you would say Carolina is a better structured team, but individual talent, I think you would take Hanifin, Theodore, and Rasmus Anderson over Slavin, Keandre Miller, and whichever third Hurricanes defenseman you like best, whether that's Sean Walker, whether that's Jalen Chatfield, whomsoever. I think right now, if you were to pick this, I think you'd have to say Vegas is probably the best team left on paper. That's the beautiful thing, though. We don't play these games on paper. We play these games out there on the ice in real time. All right, real quick. We are adding more games to the Theory of Hockey network of games. We have two right now. We have Do You Know Puck, the daily trivia game where there's multiple answers, and then The Journey. The Journey is 2 weeks old now. I give you the round and the pick the player was selected, the first team they played for, and with each clue you get, you lose a point. The fewer clues you need, the higher the score you register. Check out the games. They come out every single day on theoryofhockey.com. The Journey and Do You Know Puck. I will talk to you guys real soon. Thank you so much to everybody who tapped in for this week's show. I will talk to you guys real soon. Enjoy the Stanley Cup playoffs. Most importantly, can we see some magic happen for Montreal and for Colorado?